Hello, and welcome to the very last section of this unit. We're going to talk about the origin of new species. What do we mean by that term? Speciation just means the appearance of a new species. We are going to look at a couple of things. What factors contribute to speciation? We're going to look at two different kinds of factors, prezygotic and postzygotic, and what are possible mechanisms of speciation? How does it actually happen? We're just going to look at some different ideas: adaptive radiation, gradualism, punctuated equilibrium. One more question I have for you. Have we actually ever observed speciation? Turn to the next slide here and we'll see. Yes, we have. Usually speciation takes a really long period of time to occur, but there are instances where we have actually observed speciation in action. This is an example right here. It's a new species of saltbush. It's called Atriplex robusta. It happens to be a hexaploid organism. I don't know if you remember, diploid would be a 2N number of chromosomes that the cells have. This is hexaploid. It is 6N, and it is formed from a hybrid between another hexaploid and a tetraploid species, and that's a recent example of speciation being seen. Polyploidy. That's what we mean by, this is just a review, we've talked about this before. Polyploidy is just the duplication of chromosomes, like these 6N and 4N numbers of chromosomes. Here's another example of speciation, a recent one. Rye is a plant that has been crossed with wheat to form what is called triticale, and it's a new species of grain. And this has been done via artificial selection. Human beings actually kind of made this happen by breeding different plants the way they wanted to. So it's not natural selection. It doesn't just occur on its own. But this was due to artificial selection and people, humans, who set things up in order to create this. So what are some factors that contribute to speciation? Besides, obviously, artificial selection can certainly contribute. What are some other factors that contribute to speciation? So geographic isolation, that is something that definitely contributes to speciation. Remember that speciation in sexually reproducing organisms happens when two populations become so different in their genetic makeup that they can no longer interbreed. Here, due to geographic isolation, these two types of squirrels that live in the Grand Canyon have become different. Currently, the kaibab squirrels are classified as a subspecies of the Albert squirrels. They may, over more time, become different enough to be classified as a separate species, if in fact they become so different that they are no longer able to interbreed. So this phenomenon is a result of geographic isolation, meaning that they physically at some point became separated by the Grand Canyon and geographically isolated from each other, and their course of natural selection continued on a little bit different paths. And so they became different from one another in their populations. And that is how that happened, because of that geographic isolation. So we could also have something called ecological isolation. That occurs when two populations adapt to different habitats. An example would be these flycatchers here. We have the alder flycatcher and the willow flycatcher. They were once considered to be one species of bird, but new observations show that there are two species in this group. The habitats of the two species are different. No crossbreeding takes place between them, and while the willow flycatcher lives on brushy slopes, the alder flycatcher here lives in alder swamps. So that's an example of ecological isolation leading to speciation. So not all forms of isolation are the result of physical location. We can see mating behavior and physical characteristics, very important in isolating organisms from one another. In some cases, the gametes are not chemically compatible. For example, the sperm might not be chemically attracted to the egg, or differences in the sizes of the organisms or shape of their reproductive organs can prevent mating. A lot of different things can happen. That's common in plants, actually. Behavioral isolation can occur among animal populations, and we have that right here. If a mating pattern of a small group of organisms becomes different from that of the main group, they can become reproductively isolated. And eventually, the groups can separate and become different species. So we see that example in the mating patterns of these leopard frogs right here. They are still in the process of speciation. However, subtle differences between the northern leopard frog and the southern leopard frog in their pre-mating behavior have isolated these groups from one another. And eventually, scientists may group some of them in a new species. So we can kind of start to organize the barriers into two different groups. We have pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers, or zygotic barriers. Remember, a zygote is formed when the sperm fertilizes the egg, and it forms a zygote. Before the zygote is formed, those would be the pre-zygotic barriers, things that barriers that are happening before that little zygote forms, before fertilization. The gametes never meet and fuse. Those would be geographic isolation, behavioral or seasonal isolation. Post-zygotic barriers would be when the zygote fails to develop normally. So we actually, the organisms get to the point where fertilization occurs, the sperm fertilizes the egg, the zygote is formed, but it does not develop normally. Either the offspring themselves are sterile, or the offspring are feeble or they're not viable. Something happens, they do not develop to maturity. They're not able to then reproduce themselves. Example, obviously, the male donkey and the female horse make a sterile mule. So those would be post-zygotic barriers. Another example, we didn't really talk about this a lot, seasonal isolation. Sometimes there's a category of isolation mechanisms called temporal isolation, and it has to do with organisms that maybe mate at slightly different times of the year, or kind of a seasonal isolation where maybe with different times of year, maybe they are mating or carrying on their activities at different times of day, or different years, such as in plants. So you get, those are called temporal isolation, where the seasons or the times of day are not matching up, so that they are, it becomes a barrier. Here's another question for you. How is sexual versus asexual reproduction part of a species adaptation? It's a good question to think about. I'll let you come up with a good answer for me when I talk to you in class. So when we talk about speciation, here are just some different things we've talked about in our course of discussing speciation, different species, and what contributes to it, what might keep it from happening if the offspring are infertile, or some of the post-zygotic barriers keeps species intact and keeps the donkey and the horse as separate species because their offspring are not fertile. So remember, different kinds of isolation, reproductive types of isolation, geographic isolation. We have natural selection occurring that can lead to eventual speciation. where certain traits are chosen, and over time it leads to a new species. Remember talking about genetic drift and changes in population, and that can contribute to speciation. Hybridization can contribute to speciation, where we have the merging of two different species into a new species. So polyploidy, where we have the duplication of chromosomes, different numbers of chromosomes. This tends to happen a lot in plants. Mutations can cause speciation as well. So now that we've looked thoroughly at speciation and this idea of new species being formed, and where does the origin of species begin? Let's look at some patterns in evolution. The first pattern we're going to look at is called adaptive radiation. What is adaptive radiation? Well, it's diverse adaptations that keep the populations separate. We have rapid increase in speciation. Right here, here's an example. Darwin's finches are an excellent example of adaptive radiation. We have very diverse adaptations. We have these fruit eaters, and their beaks are this shape. We have these grasping bills and probing bills for the insect eaters, and we have seed eaters here with crushing bills. And each of these are adapted for their particular environment, for their particular ecology and their diet. And these diverse adaptations keep these populations separate. That is called adaptive radiation. The finches have adapted to different food sources and different nesting sites on the Galapagos Islands. Something else to just mention is the word stasis. This Australian lungfish is an example of an organism experiencing stasis. Species in evolutionary stasis change very little over many generations. This organism has remained the way it is for millions of years. So it's kind of the opposite of lots of changes. An organism that is in stasis changes very little. So currently, there are two different patterns of change that scientists are looking at to explain how new species are produced. And they're a little bit different from each other. We have gradualism, and that is contrasted with punctuated equilibrium. Perhaps evolutionary changes are using a little bit of each. That is probably most likely. Maybe periods of gradualism followed by periods of punctuated equilibrium. But what these terms basically mean, gradualism is the accumulation of many very gradual, constant changes that cause a species to split off and form a new species. In the model of gradualism, both species continue changing at similar rates. Punctuated equilibrium, this would occur where we have really short periods of rapid change, very rapid change, just after a population becomes isolated and forms a new species. So it's change that happens quickly, suddenly, punctuated equilibrium. The process then would slow down and approach stasis at that point. So these are two different ideas for different ways that morphological changes eventually produce a new species. Important points to remember. Remember the factors that affect speciation, those prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. We have geographic, behavioral, ecological, temporary isolation. The postzygotic, where we get sterile or unviable offspring, that ends up maintaining species and keeping them separate species. Mechanisms of speciation. Remember what we discussed about adaptive radiation and gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, different ways that speciation may occur, different mechanisms for that. Here's a few advanced ideas. If you're interested in looking at more examples of speciation, what does allopatric speciation, what does that mean, and what does sympatric speciation mean? Those are terms to describe certain kinds of speciation. What is gametic isolation? Can you find examples of that? What is meant by the term hybrid breakdown? How does it affect speciation? What's the difference between convergent and divergent evolution? So those are some interesting terms that you can research and look more into this idea of speciation. And we'll see you in class.